So we're going to look at a few things tonight. We're going to look at the lead up to Israel's independence in 1948, what happens right around the days that Israel makes the declaration of independence, and then what happens immediately after that. We'll look at some of the wars that happen, some of the things that God does in those wars, but then we're going to look at the Palestine question. It's one of those things that no one ever gives the whole picture. It's always a very slanted picture. I'm going to try to give a more clear picture for you for that. And then lastly, what you've really all been waiting for, we're going to take a snapshot look at the Israeli government. Well, that's because if we're going to pray for them, we really need to have some kind of clue about them, because their government is nothing like ours. And so just give you a snapshot of that. So that's where we are. So we're going to go back a little bit to 1912. So a couple of things to notice. The green line here shows the extent of the Ottoman Empire at its height. Now, as I mentioned last week, the Ottomans were so good at mismanagement that in the 1800s they were just taking a nosedive. And so by the time 1912 comes around, the green here is all that's left under the Ottomans' control. The rest has been sort of siphoned off. You can see there the French come in and take all those regions. Now, at that time, those boundaries aren't really there. Those are the modern boundaries, but no one back there had GPS. They didn't have the sophisticated things. So they just superimposed this on a modern map. But you have these various regions. The Italians took some. In the 1800s, England is taking parts. Now remember, as the Industrial Revolution started, Europe needed raw materials. They didn't have them, so they were going to other places to get them. This region was a perfect place to go. So that's why there's this gathering there to take everything. Along the east side of the Arabian Peninsula, you see the British taking chunks there. At this time, in North Africa and the Middle East, there's actually only two nations that are self-governing. The Ottoman Empire and Persia, today's Iran. Now, Persia at that time is being greatly influenced in the north by the Russians, because they actually want to take it over to get to the water, to have a port. The British do not want the Russians to do that, so they're moving in from the east, and all kinds of shenanigans are taking place. So that's what's happening at that time. 1812, only two independent nations in the Middle East. So if we skip forward, say about 8-10 years, we get a different picture. Because Great Britain and France won the war, World War I, and the Ottomans were on the side of the Germans, the Ottomans lost the war, and so Great Britain and France looked at that and said, oh my goodness, look what we can get. And so they actually got together and decided how to divvy up the spoils of the war. Mm-hmm. And so they went to the Ottomans and said, your empire no longer exists, and we're going to take it over. And so the Ottomans had to legally sign over all of their, we don't call it ownership, all their
real estate.
Yeah, all of their holdings in the Middle East to France and Great Britain. Now, they couldn't really take them as their property. And so at that time, there was also the League of Nations that was formed. You remember that from that high school history class you were sleeping through? Yeah. So the League of Nations comes up with this idea that these areas should really become self-governing entities. So the area that says Iraq there, that was Mandate Mesopotamia. The area here was Mandate Palestine, and that was given to the British, both of those. The French got Mandate Syria and Mandate Lebanon. And the purpose was for them to make those independent nations. Well, when we look at this, one thing that's really interesting is, with the exception of Egypt, all of the nations we see there, none of them existed 100 years ago. These are all brand new self-governing nations. And you look at the dates, Morocco's 1956. Algeria, 1962. 51. 56. We get over here, Yemen, 1967. Oman, 1970. United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, 1971. So these are all really pretty new nations. Kuwait came along much earlier, 1961. Saudi Arabia, of course, 1932. But it's this interesting, when we think of these nations, we think, oh, these are all these ancient nations. And they're not. Egypt, this is the first time they've had self-rule since Jesus Christ walked on the earth. Because the Romans had them, then the various, the Byzantines, and then the various Muslim emirates took over. So this is the first time they've actually had self-rule since that time. So it's a whole new world that's opening up there.
Were the Ottomans always Muslim?
Well, from the time they came as an empire, and I think roughly 14-something they were. I mean, going back before 630, no one was Muslim.
Yeah.
This is not Gaza, by the way. This is Europe at the end of World War II. And we sometimes forget that picture too, because Europe was a shambles. There were cities that were firebombed. There were cities that were carpet bombed. This is France. So after World War II, 1946, 1947, 1948, there is no infrastructure. It's all gone. There's actually not much of leadership because, the Germans appointed leaders in France, in Holland, in Belgium, wherever they went. Well, you're not going to trust those guys to lead you. So who's going to lead? The ones that could have led, they were put in prison or executed or something. So Europe doesn't have a clue what's going on in the world, really. But there's another interesting thing. In the midst of this chaos, you have over 250,000 Jews that are Holocaust survivors. And Great Britain is saying, well, they can't go to Palestine. We limit that to only 10,000 a year. So these Jews are put in internment camps in Europe, some of them in Germany. There's a picture for you. And so that's what's happening in Europe. It's a really difficult situation. And over the years, of course, Jews are able to make it down to Palestine, but right at that turn of the end of the World War II. Remember, in Europe, World War II started in 1939, so it went for 6 years. The British that were given this Mandate Palestine to take care of this area that they then edited and made Mandate Jordan 75% of it, and then Mandate Palestine the remaining 25%, they don't have a clue what to do any longer. There's all kinds of turmoil within Mandate Palestine. The Arabs are attacking the British because they think they're going to give the land to the Jews. The Arabs are attacking the Jews because they don't want them there. The Jews are trying to defend themselves from the Arabs, and then they realize, hey, it's the British that are causing this, so the Jews start attacking the British. So you have a three-way civil war happening. Quite a bit of confusion.
Oh, I'm sorry, what's that in the red there?
Going to get to that in a second.
Sorry.
So the British go to the United Nations and say, look, we just can't deal with this anything. You're the United Nations, this is your job, you take it. So the United Nations sitting there scratching their heads going, what do we do now? they come up with this plan, which is, let's take this land and split it between the Jews and the Arabs. They each get a piece. So the pink is what the Arabs are going to get. The blue is what the Jews are going to get. And the yellow part there, that's an international area. That's where Jerusalem is. So the Jews are sitting there going, oh, we really don't like this, but okay, we'll take it. We'll take it. The Arabs go, no way. We want it all. We're not compromising anything. That's our land. We won't take it. And they won't go along with this partition. So that's in the fall of 47. A few months later, the British dropped they dropped their latest idea, which is, oh, we've decided that May 14th, we're leaving the whole thing. So after that, it's your problem. We're not sticking around. We leave at midnight on May 14th. So in that context, a few different things are happening. One of them is the Arabs go, okay, hey, May 15th, we can attack. And so they start buying the necessary equipment of war. They start training their troops. They've got 6 months to prepare for this thing. The Jews are in a different situation because remember, this is all ruled by Great Britain. So they can't bring in weapons because Great Britain won't let them. They can't train troops because Great Britain says, oh, we're your protectors. We'll take care of things until May 15th. Well, what happens May 15th? Well, I don't know. We won't be here, but no, you can't have any weapons or any training. So the Jews have to start doing things underground. They're smuggling things in. Incredible stories we can go into there, but that's what's happening with them. But there's one other thing that's happening. May 15th, the British are going to be gone. So they actually have to come up with a whole national infrastructure that's ready to go on May 15th. Because, like, who's going to be the police? Who's going to be the fire department? And what about electricity, utilities, and water? Oh, and who's going to pay for that? And what do they use for currency? Who's going to deliver the mail? Well, I can answer that one. These are the first postage stamps that they got. And they were printed at the beginning of May, so they would have them ready on May 15th. Because they knew where the post offices were. And so they had it already, but what it says on there, it's written both, interestingly, in Hebrew and Arabic. It says Hebrew Post, which makes no sense because Hebrew is a language, it's not a country. But the problem was they didn't know what they were going to call the country. Now think about it. Why is that? Well, you don't really want to call it Palestine because that goes back to the Romans who named it that because they wanted to wipe the Jews, any memory of the Jews off the planet. And the second thing is they just tried Palestine and it doesn't leave a very good taste in your mouth. So we can't go with that. Well, what about Judah? I mean, because that's where the term Jew comes, so call it Judah. Well, there's a difficulty there too, because this region right here in the pink, the Arab territory, that's Judah. So you can't say, what's your name? Judah. And where's that? It's over in that area over there. And the same, what about Zion? We're Zionists after all. Let's call it Zion. Well, Mount Zion is just outside of Jerusalem, so that would be in the yellow area. So, and Zion, where's that? It's 2 countries away. So they're in this dilemma of trying to figure out what to call it, and they finally come up with, let's call it Israel. And so that's the decision they made. Now, Ted's asked, why is it called the State of Israel? Most likely it's because the Bible was written, the Old Testament was written before the Greeks existed. Mm-hmm. So the Greek language didn't exist. Mm-hmm. So the term we would use, republic, didn't exist for the Jews in the Old Testament. So any place in the Old Testament where it talks about governmental things, they used the term Medina, and that's translated as state. So they're calling it the state of Israel, the government of Israel. That's the best explanation that I've been able to find. So as we move to getting close there to May 14th. Now, one of the things that's important to know is that May 14th is a Friday. You're leaving at midnight. Oh, as if you didn't know that. So, I mean, it's a conspiracy theory. No, it's a conspiracy. And so the British are bailing at midnight. Now, the reason they can do that is because they know the Jews are going to be tied up with Shabbat. They also know that the Arabs don't have night vision goggles or things that they can do at night, so they know no one is going to attack at midnight when they're leaving, and they're good with that. But Ben-Gurion, the guy here who's the first prime minister of Israel, he's talking with the people. He's saying, hey, look, we've got to come up with something. So in those 6 months, he's working with all the people, trying to give them an understanding of how to work together. Now, one of the situations back then, just as we look at the first week, is you have a large secular population, and then you have a religious population. They're all Jews, but they don't agree on a lot of things, especially the religion. So he's trying to get these two sides to come together. They're writing a that's the Declaration of Independence in Hebrew there, that they're writing, that there's some sticking points. The main one being the secular Jews do not want God mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. If it's got God in it, they're not going to sign. Well, the religious Jews are going, wait a minute, that's why we're here. If you don't want God in it, we're not signing. So you can't please one side and please the other. So Ben-Gurion, this is probably why he lost his hair. But he finally gets some of the top guys from the two sides together and goes, listen, guys, this is on the Thursday, the 13th. He says, after tomorrow, we have to be ready to go. We have to make a declaration of independence tomorrow. We don't have a choice. So we need to look at something. And that's that. We need to change a term here. We're going to use the term Sur Israel. And Sur in Hebrew means rock. So he's saying, we're going to use the term Rock of Israel in this Declaration of Independence. Now, to you religious Jews, all through the Bible it says the Rock of Israel, and you know who it is, it's God. Now, you secular guys, Sur Israel, that's the might of the people, because they're all socialists, right? So it's the might of the people, so you understand that, right? So, read the thing through your own filters, and let's get this thing done. And yeah, they agreed, and were able to make that Declaration of Independence. Now, after they made the declaration, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, so everyone could go to Shabbat. When the United States found out, 11 minutes later, Harry Truman, the President of the United States, made an acknowledgement that Israel was recognized as a sovereign nation. The interesting thing was they had probably prepared because they knew something was going to happen, but see, they didn't know what it was going to be called either. So originally he wrote, recognizes the government of the new Jewish state, because they didn't know what it was going to be called. Then they found out it was State of Israel, so scratch out and handwritten in the State of Israel. So what I find really interesting is the number 2 and 3 nations to recognize Israel And depending on who you look at, it goes either way, but Iran and the Soviet Union. So Iran, I mean, that everything changed, of course, when the Ayatollahs come in later. But originally, it was those two nations that recognized them first.
But America too.
America was first. Yeah, America was first, and that was on the Friday. But then now they're a sovereign nation, but only one nation has actually recognized them. Also leading up to all of this, the Arabs in those months of preparation knew that they were going to attack. And so they went to the various Arabs living in Palestine and said, look, we're going to attack the Jews on the 15th. So get out of town. Go to the neighboring countries. Go to Lebanon. Go to Jordan. Go to Egypt. Go to Syria. But get out of the way, because we want to be able to go in there and not worry about you. And so massive amounts of Arabs over those months sort of just wandered over the border into those neighboring countries. Now, probably about 700,000. Now, there's probably about another 50 to 70,000 that the Israeli militias, there were a few different militia groups, sort of pushed out as well. But basically, it was this thing of getting out of there, because the Arab nation said, when we've driven the Jews out, you can have whatever you want. What often is completely missed is the Jewish population in the Middle East at that time. And it was huge. There were over 820,000 Jews living in the neighboring countries. 265,000 in Morocco. 75,000 in Egypt, 100,000 in Iraq. I mean, we're talking sizable groups. Well, when Israel declared independence, from that point on, persecution started, and Jews actually had to flee, often with just the shirt on their back or what they could put in a suitcase. They lost all their businesses, their properties, everything. Iran didn't drive them out. They only started drifting out in the early 50s. They weren't driven out until the Ayatollah came along in 1979. But you can see the diminishing numbers of Jews left in those countries 60, 70 years later. So as the war starts, Israel at that time is able to get about 30,000 fighting men. So it's not a huge army. They have not been able to really have maneuvers and training. They've done things underground. They've had all types of camps and other adventures to try to get people some training, but it's not like they're this well-honed machine. The other problem is they only have 15,000 weapons for 30,000 people. I don't know about you, but sharing a gun in a weapon. So that's what's happening there. By the end of the war, they have 60,000 soldiers, fighting soldiers, combat troops. In the war, they lose over 6,000. So if they lost 10% of their army, that's a huge loss in war. But when you put it against the actual population, there were only 600,000 Jews in the country, so they actually lost 1% of their population, which again is an unfathomable number in a war to have that happen. Now, remember, they are not a sovereign nation. They actually don't have the same rights as other nations. So, for instance, on May 15th, when we see the different armies attacking, the Egyptians come across the Sinai. They're a recognized sovereign nation. They're able to buy tanks, artillery, ammunition. Jordan they've been a nation for 2 years now. They got their independence in 46. Iraq, they got theirs in 1930. Syria in 1946, Lebanon in 1946. These guys have all been able to build armies and buy whatever they needed and train for it. Israel is not a sovereign nation until Saturday. All the military surplus stores are closed on Saturdays. And now you have a war. So Israel does, what best they can. Essentially, they went down to Home Depot and do-it-yourself cannons. They came up with just unique ways to fight. This is an early Israeli Defense Force patrol out. I'm sure it was somewhat staged, but notice the uniforms, the fact that there aren't any, because basically they all got a note that said, bring something from home that you don't mind getting dirty. And so there's no uniformity for quite a while. Interesting. We see at least 4 weapons on that group of 5, so that's encouraging. But the biggest hang-up was that Israel didn't have an air force. Syria, Iraq, and Egypt all had air forces trained by the British, supplied with Spitfire fighter planes from World War II. Israel didn't have an air force because it's hard to find, hide airplanes when the British are trying to keep them out. Now, they went to the United States and they checked. You could buy a P-51 Mustang fighter plane from World War II for $10,000. It's a pretty good deal. That's those prices back then, not the current translated. The only problem is you have to be a sovereign nation. And the war's already started. So they're stuck. Then they realized during World War II, Nazi Germany had captured Czechoslovakia. And in Czechoslovakia, they had actually built a Messerschmitt factory to build Messerschmitt fighter planes. Now, Czechoslovakia becomes a satellite of the Soviet Union, and so they're communist, and because of the great financial implications of communism, they're now broke. So an Israeli delegation goes up there and goes, hey, you have a factory, you can make some Messerschmitts for us. And they go, excuse me, you're not a sovereign nation. And Israel said, well, we can pay cash for the planes. Oh, you're that kind of sovereign. And so they said, okay, we can work out a deal. We'll give you Messerschmitt, we'll sell them to you for $150,000 apiece.
Cool.
And Israel goes, okay, we'll give that a try. Now, it wasn't the 100% exact Messerschmitt that Germany built because they didn't have access to the Daimler engines. They had to put this very inferior engine with much less horsepower. But it had wings, and it had guns, so we'll go for it. So just before the war starts, they get the planes and start taking them apart. They buy 4 of them. That's all they can afford at the time. 4 planes. They take them apart, get them into a cargo plane, and fly them down into Israel, and they actually arrive after the war has started. Now they've got to put them back together and not have any pieces left over. Always important. Well, it takes them a while, so they finally have the 4 planes ready to fly on May 29th. In May 29th, the war's been on for almost 2 weeks. The Egyptians have come across to Sinai, and they're sweeping up. They've gone through Gaza, and they're like 17 miles from Tel Aviv. And so they're going to do this push to Tel Aviv. And that's when the Israeli Air Force rises up and does its first sortie. Now, each one of these 4 planes was able to carry 2 250-pound bombs, which by today's standard is not much. But that's what they had. So the four planes take off. Well, almost. One of them crashes on taking off. So the three planes continue until one of them gets some engine problems and has to go back. We're now down to two planes. And so they fly over where 6,000 Egyptian troops are getting ready to make an assault 17 miles away at Tel Aviv. So Egypt has a trained army. That region was actually had a lot of German Nazis during World War II that the British had to go in and kick out and stuff. So they all know what a Messerschmitt is. They know Messerschmitts are Nazi German airplanes. So when they look up in the sky and they see a Nazi German airplane, they're going, "Ha! The Nazis are back." Well, that's good. Until they start dropping bombs on them. And they drop their 4 bombs, not a ton of damage. Then they go back to do some strafing runs until the machine guns jam, and they head off home. But the Egyptians had never seen a Nazi plane with a Star of David on it because they just didn't do that. And so the Egyptian troops, they just scatter. They literally pulled back, not knowing there really wasn't much opposition between them and Tel Aviv, and they never got any closer. That's one of those God things. And even you've got to look at the, a German plane from World War II with the Star of David.
Go figure.
How great is that?
So in this, I'm going to share just a couple of the interesting stories that happened. There's tons of stories that happened during these wars, and too many to tell, but just a couple of them are really interesting. In the War of Independence, in this time, the war goes on for 10 months, so it ends in March. But during this time, there's battles going on. One of those battles takes place at Mount Zion. And Ira Rappaport's platoon is given the job of protecting Mount Zion, which is just outside of Jerusalem. And so there they are. Hundreds of Jordanian troops have come and are attacking them. And it doesn't look really good because they're down to the last 25 bullets between them. So they say, well, let's go out and take as many of them with us as we can. And they get ready for this onslaught of the Jordanians to attack. As they see the Jordanians getting ready to make this assault, all of a sudden, the Jordanians stand up, throw down their weapons, and start screaming, "Ibrahim, Ibrahim," and run off. And Ira and his buddies are going, what just happened? Because they never attacked. Years later, Ira got to meet one of the Jordanian soldiers. And the guy goes, "You didn't see it?" "See what?" "Well, when we were ready to attack, all of a sudden this huge vision of Abraham or Ibrahim came down and defended you. There was no way we could attack."
Oh my gosh. I never heard that.
God. This is one of Israel's also homemade armored vehicles. It's great. Wonders what you can do. That when you can't buy stuff, you've got to come up with a way to deal with it. So they made some of these. Probably still useful, right?
Ice cream truck.
So up in the north of Israel, there was a kibbutz that was being assaulted by the Syrian troops. So they sent up some of these armored vehicles to sort of see if they could rescue them. Well, as they're near the Lebanese border, again, it's before GPS, they take a left turn instead of a right turn, and now they're actually in Lebanon. So this Israeli group in these armored vehicles is in Lebanon, but they don't actually find out until they run into a Syrian convoy of brand new armored vehicles protecting a convoy of supply trucks. So the Israelis jump out of their vehicle and start shooting. Because I mean, what else are you going to do? And they hit the gas tank in the first truck, which catches fire and blows up, which caused the next truck to catch fire, which happened to be carrying hand grenades. Not a good combination. And so a number of the trucks start blowing up, and the Syrians just take off running to get away from the problem. And so now, fortunately, they had enough Israeli guys with driver's license or driving ability that could actually capture the unburned or destroyed supply trucks and the vehicles, the armored vehicles, and they take them across and head over to the kibbutz. Well, when they get to the kibbutz, there's no assault. Well, there was an assault, but when they heard the explosions coming from Lebanon, they realized, oh my goodness, Israel has invaded Lebanon. Let's get out of here. And so they hightailed it back to Syria.
Wow.
So, was it a wrong turn? Now, one of the prime ministers of Israel said, in Israel, we do not believe in miracles. We depend on them. So we come now, just to give you an overview again. This is, of course, in 1888. You got the number at the bottom there, when it's all ruled by the Ottomans. The British come in 1918, and we have this Mandate Palestine coming up until 1946, 48. Then in 46, 47, Jordan is giving its freedom. Egypt is given the region of Sinai, and we have this part that's left of Mandate Palestine that the UN is saying, let's divvy it up and give half to the Jews and half to the Arabs. And that's what leads to a war. So a war that goes on for 10 months, and in those 10 months, Egypt actually captures the Gaza Strip. So they have complete control of that. So by the March of 1949, Jordan, now its boundary was very clear there. It's the Jordan River. That's a good boundary for Jordan. Well, they invade Israel and they capture over 2,000 square miles of Israel, the western bank of the Jordan, hence the name the West Bank. And Jordan claims it as part of Jordan. It's ours now. Well, the interesting thing is, the only country in the world that recognized that was Great Britain. No one else did. So they'd invaded the land. Remember all those Palestinians or those Arabs that had, vacated to the other place? Well, about 700,000 of them moved into this new region. They kicked out all the Jews that were there. So like 40,000 Jews living in that region were kicked out. They captured the old city of Jerusalem. And in 1948 during the war, and they kicked all the Jews, some whose family had lived there for hundreds of years. They destroyed the synagogues, and that was the status quo for 19 years. So no Jews could go into that region. None could go into the old city. They couldn't go to the Western Wall. They were just excluded. 19 years later, 1967, we have the 6-Day War, because it lasted 6 days. We're going to call it that. In that war, Israel was actually, even though they were attacked by 4 armies, they were able to capture Gaza and capture the West Bank from Jordan. And so now they have the land that they'd actually declared sovereignty over, because when Great Britain left, they declared sovereignty over all of this. They were the only ones that did that, and so now they have that land back. But when Jordan had it, all of those Arabs living there were given they were made Jordanian citizens. So they had Jordanian passports if they wanted a passport. It was part of Jordan in their eyes. So now they have Jordanian citizens in their nation. 700,000 of them that they didn't have 6 days before. Now, here's where the dilemma comes in, because with all of the other Arabs that did stay in Israel and these Jordanian citizens, there's now more Arabs than Jews. So if you want to give them citizenship, you no longer have a Jewish state. You have something that in the first election is going to be an Arab state. So they can't do that. And so, you know, they had not had any plans to start a war and take the West Bank. So they were not prepared for what's going to happen. And that's why we have this big question. But when people say there's an occupation, how can you occupy the territory that people have recognized as your sovereign territory? Jordan occupied it. Israel hasn't occupied it. So we then come a few years later, and another war, the Yom Kippur War in 1973, and this time it's only Syria and Egypt. So it's only two nations attacking me this time. That's much better odds. And this time they're able to take the Golan Heights, which is where the Syrians had artillery that they would fire into the Galilee and hit homes. So not a good place to be. And they also took all of the Sinai. So again, the Arabs lost big time in this. They actually had people move in and start moshavs or kibbutzes in the Sinai. So farming communities started there, Jewish farming communities. Trying to think of something else. All of a sudden. Brain goes dead. Okay. So in that Yom Kippur War is again one of these. Now there's tons of stories. This is the last one from this war. But when they were fighting in the Golan Heights, one of the commanders had a unit, and they were pulling back from a confrontation with the Syrians, when all of a sudden they find themselves in a minefield, which is not a good place to be. And so how do you get out of there? Well, they get down, lay down, and they take out their bayonets, and they sort of are sliding them through the ground to hit the side of the mine, because that won't blow up, and hoping that they can find a way out. Well, one of the soldiers just starts praying, calling out to God. A windstorm comes and causes a sandstorm. Can you imagine in a minefield, which is bad enough, and now you're in a minefield in a sandstorm? It's like it started out bad and it suddenly got worse. Or did it? Because when the wind finally stopped, this is what they saw. All the mines were visible, and they were just able to walk out, no one moved. You know, those are the kind of things you can't make up. You pray and something happens. Israel's had a lot of wars. For me, in red there are the major wars where they've been at war with numerous nations. The other wars are only with one other nation, And then we have these wars, which is from Lebanon, and the Gaza wars have been with terrorist organizations. So Lebanon first one was with the PLO, actually. Next one was with Hezbollah, and then these three have all been with Hamas. In the Gaza war, just a couple of again, just interesting stories where you have to say, this has to be God. It just doesn't work otherwise. So these are actually from this last year, 24. There was a unit in Gaza that they had just come out of a military confrontation, and they were sitting down taking a break. One of the guys decides to clean his weapon, so he follows the right procedures, takes the magazine out, checks it with his finger, and then, wants to make sure it's clear, so he just goes behind him like this into an empty field and goes pulls the trigger, nothing should happen except kaboom. There was a bullet in the chamber. But what he didn't know was there were 2 terrorists that had just come out of a tunnel shaft carrying an RPG, and he hit it. And he eliminated 2 terrorists. I mean, you can't plan that, Another one, and this one's really interesting, as they're clearing these different buildings for, explosives and booby traps and stuff like that, there's a messianic believer in one of the units. And so he's in there, and as he's, going through this, there's, again, protocols. You have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this, because you want to keep everyone safe. And that way, it's been done right. So he comes to a door, and the protocol is set a charge and blow the door, and, then check it. So he's about to set the charge, and he just senses the Holy Spirit saying, just open the door. Yeah, right. But it keeps coming back. And so every time he goes to set the charge, finally he goes, okay. He takes and opens the door. Inside, Hamas has shoved a bunch of women and children because they know what the protocol is. They want to accuse him of war crimes. Well, it rescued all the children and women because they weren't blown up, and it prevented them from being accused of war crimes. Just unbelievable. But that's current. That's this year. God has been working, doing miracles in every one of the wars, and He's still doing it today. So, as we're looking upon that whole thing with Gaza, it's Hamas, which is this Palestinian entity. And so we really do need to look at the Palestine question. We are not talking about Arab people here. We're not talking about Palestinian people. We're talking about an ideology. Valerie and I have met numerous Arabs in the land, Israeli Arabs, and we've met Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank. And they're great people. They're friendly, they're hospitable, very enjoyable. So we're not talking about the people. We're talking about this controlling entity that's there. That whole Palestinian thing is a distortion because the Ottomans, when they deeded the land to Great Britain and France, they gave up all rights to it, so it wasn't stolen. They did that because they lost the war. But actually, a year after the Balfour Declaration, while the Ottomans were still an entity, they actually made a proclamation saying that they were sympathetic to there being a Jewish homeland in that region called Palestine. That's the Ottomans. The League of Nations, which formed, they actually got together and made sure that all of these things were done legally. There was 100% agreement that the Jews should have a nation in Palestine. It wasn't like 49-51. It was 100%. All of the nations in the League of Nations agreed to it. And it was a right to create a sovereign state in Israel. And that was also made part of the UN Charter. So it didn't get canceled. It went right into the UN when it was formed. So it guaranteed that Jews had an unalterable right to live anywhere in Palestine, not a certain region, and that could not be changed. And the region was defined as being between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. So it's very clear the region we're talking about. That was part of this given with the mandates. So Jews have a right to live in Jerusalem, in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. It's a legal right. Now, Arabs were never granted political rights under the Mandate for Palestine.
Hmm.
They were given political rights in Lebanon, Iraq, Transjordan, and Syria. So they were given political rights in 4 nations. Israel was given political rights in 1 place. So we actually already had a 5-state solution. Why do we need a 2-state solution? We've already tried it. Actually, we tried to put a state in Gaza. It didn't work after 20 years. So Palestine was never a nation. It was only a region, just like we would say New England or the Midwest. Palestinian as a people are Arabs. Their DNA, their culture, their language. It's, if you got them together, even their names, people that are Palestinians, if you check their name, often it's an Egyptian name or a Syrian name or a Jordanian name, because those regions have names tied to them. And so that's the case there. Now, prior to 1948, everybody living in Mandate Palestine was a Palestinian. If you wanted a passport, you were given a Palestinian passport, whether you were Jew or Arabs. Now, the interesting thing is the Arabs didn't like being called Palestinians because they were Arabs. Because if they were called Palestinians, they felt like they were being lumped with the Jews. In the 1948 war, when Jordan captured that whole region of the West Bank, they settled, again, Jordanian citizens there. Why didn't they give the Arab people their own state? Why did they keep it for themselves? Why didn't they give them the opportunity to have their own state? Well, this guy explains part of it, Yasser Arafat. In 1964, now Yasser Arafat was an Egyptian. He was born in Cairo, Egypt in 1929, so he wasn't really a Palestinian. But he came up to the West Bank. He actually fought in the War of Independence on the Arab side. But he came up into the West Bank and joined the PLO in 1964. Now, the PLO's purpose was to liberate Palestine from Israel. But if the yellow there is Palestine and the Jordanians are controlling it until 1967, how can they liberate it from Israel? That doesn't make a lot of sense. Arafat is actually the one that promoted the term of Palestinian among the people living in Israel. He's the one that sort of made that the key phrase. Now, there's a lot of history with the Palestinians in the region that's not very popular. And that comes from, I think I mentioned the first week, when in 1951, a Palestinian actually assassinated the king of Jordan, King Abdullah. That's not a good way to make friends. Then in 1971, when a lot of Palestinians had left the West Bank, or the ones that had not ever made it back in, well, the PLO was moving into Jordan, and they actually tried to overthrow the Jordanian government, which, I mean, they had quite an army, and fortunately the Jordanian was able to squash that, and they kicked the PLO out. So the PLO actually moved up to Lebanon. And 10 years later, of course, we have the Lebanon War because the PLO was attacking Israel from Lebanon. Israel got tired and said, we're going in, which meant the PLO got kicked out of Lebanon. And so they've been repeatedly kicked out. And then the last one, it wasn't the PLO in this situation, but in the Gulf War in 1991 in Kuwait, there were 400,000 Palestinians living in Kuwait. When Saddam Hussein attacked Kuwait and invaded it, they sided with Saddam Hussein. And they did everything they could to make Saddam Hussein win. Well, it didn't quite work out that way for them. So when they were defeated, Saddam Hussein was defeated, the Kuwaitis kicked 380,000 out. So only 20 remain in Kuwait today. And so they are sort of an undesirable group of people to have live in your nation. None of the Arab nations actually will take them in and give them a citizenship anymore. The ones in Jordan that stayed, they have it, but no one's giving them any more citizenship. So that's what's happening with the Palestinian question. It's distorted. We don't hear this side. We hear about all of the terrible things that Israel does in the news. All these deaths that have happened in Gaza. There's been more births in Gaza this last year than there have been deaths. So if it's ethnic cleansing, Israel is doing a very poor job. So some milestones with the Palestinian question. The 1978 Camp David Peace Accord, in that Israel gave the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt with the agreement that there would be peace. Now, one of the things that happened with that was, of course, we'd had some moshavs and kibbutzes started there. Well, they got kicked out. One of those kibbutzes that was kicked out ended up starting Ein Hapsur in south of just outside of Gaza. They're the guys that came to Conduit, the two brothers that came about a year ago, Ein Hapsur. That's where their parents had to move out from in 1978. In 1987, the first Intifada started, which was basically when the PLO invented suicide bombings.
What does intifada mean?
Yes. Now, 1988 is really interesting because the PLO declares an independent state 40 years after Mandate Palestine, and that they sort of realized, oh, hey, we missed it by 40 years. Now, they don't have a land, they don't have anything, they just make this declaration while they're in Morocco. So that makes a lot of sense. In 1993, we have what's called the Oslo Accords. Israel agrees to concede some areas of control to something new called the Palestinian Authority. This is something that Yasser Arafat had come up with. It's basically just a political arm of the PLO. And so Israel is willing to give some cities to have control if we'll have peace. In 2000, Prime Minister Ehud Barak is willing to give up 91% of the West Bank. That's like most of it. This is in July. In September, the second Intifada starts. And suicide bombs in buses, cafes, pizzerias. 1,000 Israelis killed. Just because they didn't get that last 9%, I don't think it would have made much difference. 2005 in Gaza, they come up with the idea of a disengagement. It's Ariel Sharon, who was a general in the IDF, but he's now the prime minister, and he's basically says, look, let's get rid of the problem with Gaza. Let's just give it to the Palestinians and they can have it and do their own thing and we don't have to worry about it anymore. So in in that year, there were Jews living there. So the IDF actually evicted over 8,000 Jews living in Gaza. Some of them, again, have lived, family-wise, lived there for centuries. They didn't just move in, but they had lived there for centuries, history there. They bulldozed the towns. They actually dug up the graves in the graveyard so there wouldn't be anything left of any Jewish significance. So in 2006, they have elections in the West Bank and in Gaza. And Gaza elects Hamas to lead in the first and only election. Now, it had been in 2005, the Palestinian Authority had been ruling, and Hamas is very different. So they actually executed anyone from the Palestinian Authority that was left. The West Bank elects Mahmoud Abbas as president for a 4-year term. He's currently in his 19th year of that 4-year term. So no Palestinian Arab living in Israel under the age of 37 has ever had a chance to vote. So we're not talking about democracies here. We're talking about dictatorships. And, you know, it's just unique what we don't hear. It's all there. But what sort of gets ignored. The last thing I want to look at is the Israeli government. And that's to give you something. We're told to pray for leaders, obviously in our own country, and we can rejoice that something happened this week. But as we pray for Israel, we really need to understand that how Israel works as a nation. So this is not the Israeli government. This is the House of Representatives in the United States. And as you can see, it's just those 4 seats extra that make it Republican. And we have that one lone gray spot that happens to be the independents. But otherwise, we have 2 parties. Okay? Israel's is quite different. In Israel, there's at least 50 political parties. So they don't have donkeys and elephants, they have the zoo. So in the government, there's only one house. There's just the Knesset. They don't have a Senate in the House of Representatives. There's just the one. And it has 120 seats. So to get into the government, any political party has to have a certain percentage of the popular vote. It's quite low, but unless you hit that threshold, you don't make it into the government, and those votes are really discarded. Well, no one has ever been able to have a majority. And so it's always been these coalitions, so it's always cobbled together. Hey, will you be part of my government? So whoever wins the most votes sort of has the job of seeing who they can work with. But it's a very diverse group because you can see here the spectrum. This is the far right. You've got some extremely far right. I mean, they're a bit right of far right. And then you've got the right. And then these 2 gray, these are the ones in the government, okay? So there's other groups as well. But the 2 gray there, they're the religious parties. So they're not really concerned about foreign policy. They just want Jewish law in the public square. They want to get that part pushed up. Then you have more the center parties, and then the last 2, Labor and Meretz. I mean, we can say they're liberal. They're actually communist, okay? I mean, really, they are communist. But then we have the 2 green parties. They're not the Greens. They're Arabs. So within the Knesset, you actually have Arab parliamentarians. They're not restricted from being in the government. There's even Supreme Court justices in Israel that are Arabs. So there is representation.
Are they Islam? Are they Muslims?
I'm not sure if the guy is Muslim. These guys are Muslims.
Right.
But yeah, if that guy in the Supreme Court is Muslim, I don't know. You do have Christian Arabs, and you have Muslim, more Muslim than Christian, of course. But that's sort of this spectrum that you're dealing with. Now, we just elected Trump. You don't have that option there. You don't vote for an individual, you vote for a party.
Mm-hmm.
And the party has this long list going from 1 to probably 120, not that they'll ever get that. But the number of seats they get, that's who gets in. And then they decide who's going to be the prime minister. So you can vote for someone, and that doesn't mean that you get them for a prime minister, because you're only voting for a party. So very different. Because it's all negotiated, because there's all these positions, you have Secretary of Defense or Minister of Defense, Minister of Finance, Minister of, you name it, they're all there. That's going to be divided up by whoever is the ruling party. Now, currently there's, the ruling coalition is 64 seats. So it's a majority, but it's not a lot because some of these parties are split. It's not like the 7 there is actually 3 parties that come together. So they make coalition parties that they know will get enough votes to get in. So they're not that united either. So there's always conflict happening. And so that's why it's so important for Israel's government. If you read the news this week, just the other day, Netanyahu fired the Minister of Defense. That's not necessarily bad. It's just at a unique time, and then everyone has an opinion on it. And so now that starts all kinds of demonstrations. Everyone is more interested in that than actually getting on with the job, because so much of it is a power struggle. So that's, in a nutshell, some thoughts as we close this up. Isaiah 68 says, "Can a nation be born in a day?" Well, God proves it can. I think when Isaiah wrote that, he had no idea of what would happen a few thousand years later. Now, Israel was able to declare independence. They were able to withstand 5 armies attacking them. They never got any help from any other nation. They were left on their own. Everyone thought they were going to tank, and that was it. And then we're done with that problem. But they prevailed. They won. And through the last 76 years, there's been war after war. There's been all kinds of turmoil. It's been nations against them. It's been terrorist groups against them. It's been other entities such as the UN, media. Remember the first week. This is a tiny nation, surrounded, as Bibi says, we're in a very rough neighborhood. They are. And yet they've been able to prevail against all odds. Now that's because God's had a plan. They haven't ever seen it, but they've experienced it by what they've seen happening. And God is continually doing miraculous things. We see it through all of these different incredible stories during the war, but often their eyes are veiled. And like Ben Gurion said, "To you, the rock of Israel is the might of the people." Well, it is the God of Israel. But their eyes have a difficulty seeing that sometimes. Now, the Arab people of Gaza and West Bank, they need to be touched by the truth of Jesus. They need to be set free from this oppressive ideology that really uses them. I mean, the idea of having human shields is just so evil and wicked. And yet somehow that's been absorbed as a natural thing.
Mhm.
So they need Jesus to come. And there's things happening there where he is going. Roughly a year ago, 200 Gaza men on the same night saw a vision of a man in white coming.
Mm.
And they got saved.
Oh my God.
You know, it's
Wow.
happening.
Yeah.
It's not going to make it on CNN.
Yeah.
It just doesn't. It goes against the narrative. But God is moving.
Yeah.
So next week, we're actually going to look at some of the things that Valerie and I have been able to actually see and hear firsthand, where God is really moving and it's real. So it'll be more story time again. But God is doing some incredible things, exciting things, and just revolutionary things. And there's a
Next
reason.
week, 'cause we won't.
Not next week. I'm sorry.
It's
Next week. Thank you.
Here.
Yes. Yeah, we're gone next week. So that is where we'll go 2 weeks' time. On the last page there. Okay, that's good. I'm good with that. On the last page there, I've given you some prayer points, intercession. And it ties to what we shared about during this time. Pray for God to breathe His Spirit on the people. It's when God comes that things change. And so there's scriptures there that you can pray out. These are right out of the Bible. So if you make them a prayer, you're praying in a complete agreement with God, which is always good, much better way to do it. And then pray for the IDF leaders. They have to make decisions that are just, I don't know how they come up with what they have to decide. I mean, is Iran going to attack them with nuclear weapons? Is he going to attack them, or is it just a thing to keep them off balance? Do they strike first? I mean, what do you do? And so God brings revelation. And he actually brings revelation to people that don't always acknowledge him. That's how he gets to them. Pray that God speaks to the Arab people in Gaza and in Judea, Samaria, the West Bank. That's where change will come. And pray especially protection over the Arab Christians. They're a minority. Just some stats down there. In 1947, Bethlehem had 85% Christian of the population. In 98, it was down to 40%. And by 2016, only 16%. And that's because there is a Muslim mafia that really is tough and brutal. And then there's the whole Palestinian Authority system, which is not Islamic. It's basically a power-hungry, take what you can kind of mentality. And so they've gone in also just forcing the Christians out. And so the Christians are in a very tough place. There are some incredible things happening among the Christians in the Arab community, but they're in a difficult situation.